Welcome back again to educator.com. Thanks for continuing along to one of the most important lessons you'll ever have, good and bad reasoning. Now, like everything else with the critical thinking section, this is only an introduction. This is not exhaustive. This is not everything you need to know, but it is going to get you started and is going to get you going in the right direction. So please follow along and pay attention. So, for this lesson, we'll go over a quick overview first. I'm going to give you some general rules about, arguments and rules and, just kind of stuff that's generally conventions and things about debates and arguments and, conflicting issues and stuff like this. And then we're going to go over those types of empirical evidence. Now, you remember what empirical means is it means that something that you get by the senses. And then after we go over types of evidence you might use, we're going to go over the rational part of our thinking selves. And we'll be thinking about how we put evidence together into an argument that makes sense. After all, just giving evidence by itself and something that you get by your senses doesn't really mean anything unless you actually arrange it in a certain way. And then the really fun part, the fallacies. Fallacies are when somebody tries to use logic, but they mess up somehow. And I'll be helping you spot those so that you won't be so suckered by, people, doing things like name calling and other bad things when they're trying to convince you of something. After all this, you are going to be preparing your own argumentative paper. We'll be learning how to organize it, and that'll probably be one of the most important and hopefully one of the most fruitful classes and papers you ever write. So, what is an argument? Well, this is kind of what I mean. Reasons plus conclusions equals argument. Now, when I say argument, do I mean, people fighting? Do I mean people going to fisticuffs over an issue? Do I mean, people name-calling or being mean or, God forbid, shouting at each other? No, that's not what I mean by argument at all. What I mean by argument in this context for this lesson is it just means giving good reasons to believe a conclusion. Okay, that is all what I mean by arguing or argument here. Giving good reasons to believe a conclusion. Argument doesn't have to be a bad word. In normal speech, it normally is. But for the sake of this lesson and for the sake of, learning how to think critically, it just means giving good reasons to believe a conclusion. Now, one of the most important things we got to learn, one of the most general rules, is this idea called burden of proof. If you remember this rule, you'll be able to avoid a lot of, issues and controversies and maybe debates that you don't want to be involved in. Burden of proof. Let's read this carefully. Miss Scarlett is on trial for the murder of Mr. Body. Is she guilty? The prosecutor says, yes, she is guilty. And the defense attorney says, no, she is innocent. Now think about that. Imagine you're in the courtroom, you're seeing the prosecutor do some stuff, and you're seeing the defense attorney say some stuff. Who has to prove their case? The prosecutor, the defense attorney, or both? It turns out only the prosecutor has to prove anything. And here's why. Whoever says yes has to prove that their case is true. And whoever says no only has to show that the asserter, the one who's saying yes to an issue, doesn't have enough reasons. Now, we don't do this just because of, our legal implications of this thing called the presumption of innocence, but we also do it because you can't prove a negative. You can't prove a negative. Imagine if you went up to your teacher and said, teacher, I turned in my homework, but what happened is that the tiny gnome people in school took it and ate it. Okay, your teacher's going to roll her eyes, and she's not going to believe you, or he's not going to believe you. But imagine if you tried to say, well, why don't you just prove that the gnomes didn't do it? A teacher would say, well, we have cameras in schools at night, and the cameras didn't pick up any of the tiny gnome people. And you'd say something like that, well, that's because the tiny gnome people are invisible. And the teacher would say, well, we also have motion sensors in school, and they would have detected the tiny gnome people. And then you might say something like, well, the tiny gnome people can float above the ground, and, they won't be detected by the motion sensors. And no matter what your teacher says, look, I don't see any reason to believe in the tiny gnome people, you could always come back with something that says, well, the tiny gnome people were doing something different, the tiny gnome people were doing something else. No matter what, you'd be able to come up with some reason why that evidence doesn't work. So if you say the tiny gnome people stole and eat my homework, you have to prove it, because nobody can prove a negative. All right, here's another general rule. Issues. Now remember from last lesson, an issue is kind of a question. It's a way of phrasing something before you come up with a thesis. The general rule, and it's because, debates tend to explode and issues tend to get so wide and reaching, is you really, really want to narrow down your issue and your question into a yes-no format. This will help you with your thesis and your brainstorming. It'll help focus you and it'll help make things easier on you. So here's some examples of framing the issue in a good way. Are the fees for adoption services too expensive? Yes, no. Should we censor the internet at libraries? Yes, no. Did Miss Scarlet kill Mr. Body? Yes, no. Now here's some ways that I don't think are so good. Is adoption best nationwide, statewide, or international? Okay, that's not a yes or no question. That's very, very broad, and you could write a persuasive essay that way, but it'd be best to just say something like, is adoption best nationwide? Yes, no. What kinds of websites should be censored on the internet? Okay, this is a very good question, and it is something that would be important to figure out, but if you're writing an entire paper, a better way to phrase this would be to pick a certain type of website, let's say video game websites, and we could say, is it appropriate to censor video game websites at libraries? Yes, no. Who killed Mr. Body? Was it Miss Scarlet, Professor Plum, the maid, Colonel Mustard? Okay, that's too many suspects. Let's get it down to one each, and we'll just ask yes, no for our suspects. Now that we have two general rules, let's start going over types of empirical evidence. One of the most common types of empirical evidence is statistics. Now, statistics are actually numbers. They're not something that you see or sense, but they do represent a lot of data and a lot of evidence that's gathered together and shown as kind of a numerical trend going up or going down, and they also show huge generalizations about things. Here's examples of a couple statistics. The cost of college has risen by 200% in the last 10 years. Right, that's a number and a period of time. That is showing a trend going like this over time. The national ratio of women to men in colleges is 2.8 to 1. Okay, this is not showing a trend over time, but it is showing a generalization. It's showing that, for every man in college, there's 2.8 women. Now, there's no such thing as 0.8 women, so, it's not precise. It is a generalization. It is an average, but you kind of get the idea. Here's another statistic. The Earth's average temperature has risen by 1 degree over the last 5 years. So is this a generalization or a trend? You can kind of see for yourself what it is. Now, there is an old saying. There are white lies, black lies, and statistics. What do I mean by that? Well, using statistics can be very, very deceptive at times. And sometimes people draw conclusions way too quickly just because they have some statistics. So, here's an example. The national ratio of women to men in college is 2.8 to 1. Therefore, colleges reject men and favor women. Is that really enough reason to believe that? I'll show you why it isn't in a moment. The Earth's average temperature has risen by 1 degree over the last 5 years. Therefore, humans are causing global warming. Now, does anybody disagree with this? Well, I'm not saying it's wrong, but I am about to show you that this reason right here is not enough reason by itself to believe this conclusion, even though probably most of you all agree that that conclusion is correct. Here, let's go back. The national ratio of women to men is 2.8 to 1. Therefore, colleges reject women and favor men. So, what about this important question, though? How many young men actually apply to college in the first place? That'd be another important statistic we'd need to know before we could draw this conclusion over here. So what's the ratio of men to women, or women to men, of the applicants? Well, what if it turned out that only one man applied for every 3 women? So that's pretty close to that 2.8 to 1 ratio. So maybe the issue isn't that colleges reject men and favor women. Maybe the issue, the cause of this statistic, is just that not enough men are actually applying to college. Here is another kind of more abstract example. The Earth's temperature has risen by 1 degree over the last 5 years. So what does this statistic show? Well, it shows that the Earth's temperature is rising, but it hasn't told us anything about what's actually causing it. Well, there's lots of things that could cause the Earth's temperature to rise, like there's this thing called the 11-year sun cycles. The sun is not just a ball of flame, it's a ball of flame that changes and rotates and has certain cycles. And sometimes the sun's a little bit warmer than on some years than it is on others. So maybe this 5-year trend is just an effect of this 11-year sun cycle. So is 5 years really long enough for scientific standards? Now, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a climatologist, but I'm pretty sure it's not. So this statistic by itself is not enough reason to believe that humans are causing global warming. We need more. Now, let's think about science for a bit. In fact, let's think about astronomy. You believe that the Earth orbits the sun, not the other way around, right? Yeah, most of us do. We all know that, despite the fact that, well, we normally see the sun rise, and when we look outside and we kind of look at the sky, we notice it does appear to be traveling across the sky. And also, I've never felt the Earth spinning. Me personally, and probably you not, I as well, have never felt that the Earth is spinning. So our senses actually tell us that the sun orbits the Earth. But we don't trust our senses because of why? Well, because of the experts. We trust them because of the experts. We trust them because we believe that somebody else has done a lot of work with their senses and with this empirical evidence and has given a lot of work to show us that, well, no, the solar system is actually not what it seems to be the first time you look at it. Now, if we all wanted to, we could pull out telescopes and we could all do math and we could all figure it out for ourselves, but, that's a lot of work. So, one way to get empirical evidence is to trust an expert. But when you're getting expert testimony, make sure they are an expert in something related to your issue. So here's a couple examples. What if my issue was urban crime? Well, I'd probably want to talk to a New York police investigator. I bet that guy knows a lot about urban crime. Thinking of astronomy, astronomers are probably the people I want to trust about the solar system. Ancient civilizations, the Mayans, Egyptians, whoever, archaeologists certainly. I'm probably not going to be, asking my English professor about that. Now, just because you're an expert doesn't mean that you're an expert in everything. Would you trust a physicist on a healthy diet? There's probably somebody better to tell you about what's a healthy diet. How about a medical doctor on the issue of British history? Well, doctors are very, very smart people, but I don't see why being a medical doctor would mean that you know a lot about British history. I like police investigators, but they don't know anything about foreign travelers in Asia. Okay, these are examples of when you wouldn't use these experts. So it's kind of common sense, but just make sure that if you're going to go to an expert, that they're an expert in something related to the issue that you're discussing. Now, when we're going for all these expert sources and we're looking for experts, let's remember which is the best kind of sources to look for. You remember from the research lesson, we went over fact-checking and quality assurance, or quality checking. So how is that for Wikipedia? How about blogs? How about magazines? Academic articles? internet, and books. If you are making a really strong case and you're making an argumentative paper, please use the most fact-checked and quality-assured sources you can find. The reason why is that if you're going to cite something that isn't fact-checked, that isn't quality-assured, and it turns out to be wrong or erroneous, and that was a critical part of your argument, not only will you feel embarrassed, but you might not get such a great grade. So, now that we've kind of gone over evidence, how do we put the evidence together? Remember, those statistics, the 2.8 women to men ratio in college, and then we drew a conclusion from that. Evidence by itself doesn't mean anything. We have to kind of put evidence together in a meaningful way, and in a way that's logical and rational. So, let's go over this old little syllogism that I gave you a while back. If you drink coffee, you will feel awake. You drink coffee, you feel awake. This little form here, sentence 1, 2, and then therefore conclusion, is called a syllogism. And this is an example of deductive reasoning. I'm going to go over a couple examples of deductive reasoning with you now, and then after that you'll be able to kind of see how you could actually put this into all kinds of sources and arguments and actually frame them for yourselves. This first common type is called modus ponens. Now, I'm going to give you lots of names like that, but the names aren't so much as important as what they do. So, if phrase P, then phrase Q, phrase P, therefore Q. Now, you might be thinking, oh, why is he talking in math? I thought this was an English course. Well, I'm just using these as examples for variables because that kind of helps us put them together. So, if you drink coffee, you will feel awake. You drank coffee, you feel awake. So this is an example of if P, then Q. P happens, therefore Q. If number 1 is true and number 2 is true, then we can draw the conclusion. This is another one called the hypothetical syllogism. This one is going to be a little bit easier. If P, then Q. If Q, then R. Therefore, if P, then R. This one is going to be really easy to understand. If it is summer, P, then it is hot, Q. If it is hot, Q, then we will go for a swim, R. Therefore, if it is summer, P, then we will go for a swim, R. So, does that make sense to you? Go ahead and watch it one more time if it's a little unclear. This is another great type of argument, and you'll hear this a lot. It's called the disjunctive syllogism. Either P or Q. Not Q, therefore P. Students must study hard or fail a class. P or Q. Students must not fail. Q. Therefore, students will study very hard. P. That's a pretty simple way to put the argument. Here's another great one. And this is one you're going to be I'd like you to pay close attention to because it's a great way to argue. This is called the reductio ad absurdum. Now, the reductio ad absurdum is Latin for reduce to the absurd. And what you're doing here is that you're actually taking two alternatives and you're kind of showing that one of them is just silly and you don't want that, so everybody should listen to the other conclusion that you're presenting. So, reductio ad absurdum starts this way. I want to prove that P is true and that P is what we want. So, if not P, then Q. And then in the next sentence, you're going to argue that Q is false, silly, absurd, or something that nobody wants, therefore P. So, if we do not use capital punishment, we will have more murders. Okay, so which one's P and which one's Q? Murders are very bad. So this is a way of saying Q is false or absurd. So therefore, what? P. We need capital punishment. We need the death penalty. So that is a conclusion that we're drawing. This is a very common way to argue, so please pay close attention to it. It's also very effective, and it's also very logical. Don't be afraid to use this in your own papers. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, nobody says if P then Q, or if Q then R, or not P or Q. Nobody talks that way. And you are absolutely right. We use these variables to kind of show just very basic ways to think logically. But when we're speaking, we don't say things that way. So in normal speech, a lot of these syllogisms would be implicit and they'd sound more like this. Well, how do students learn? By studying hard. In fact, no student wants to fail. Either study hard or fail. All right, so what syllogism was that? Can you think it's maybe that, disjunctive either-or type of syllogism? He can never feel awake unless he's had his cup of coffee. That is why he drank his coffee in the morning, so he could be alert. All right, so which syllogism was that? Well, that was the very first one, the modus ponens. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Now, how about this one? If Miss Scarlet killed Mr. Body, she'd have blood on her fingertips. But there is no such evidence. There is no blood on her fingertips. Therefore, she did not kill Mr. Body. Which syllogism was that one? I bet you can figure that out. Now, not all logic is equal. Some logic is actually really, really bad. So what I'm going to go over now are these logical fallacies, and I'd like you to keep those editorials you read in mind as I'm going over these, because I'm willing to bet that some of those editorials you read had a lot of logical fallacies in them, because, well, sadly, even though logical fallacies are wrong, they're extremely popular. This first type of logical fallacy is something called an ad hominem. Ad hominem is a Latin term for against the person. It's like you're fighting the person, but you're not actually talking about their argument. And it works like this. The first person says, these statistics imply that colleges favor women over men. The second person is skeptical and does not believe this claim and says, you're only saying that because you're a boy. Has this second person responded to the argument, or have they responded to the person saying the argument? Here's a more dramatic example. First person, we should not eat meat because factory farming is cruel to animals. The second person says, you're a hunter. You shoot animals for sport. All right, what has this second person proved? This second person has proved that this first person is a hypocrite. And this first person is inconsistent. What was the issue? Was the issue whether or not we should eat meat, or whether or not the first person is a hypocrite? The issue is whether or not we should eat meat. So you could see why you wouldn't want to listen to somebody like this. You don't want to listen to a hypocrite, and that's natural and that's good. But that's not the issue in this statement here. This person, first person, he could be right that factory farming is cruel to animals, even though he loves to go out and, shoot a deer every once in a while. It doesn't matter. So, ad hominem is very, difficult to kind of, take away sometimes, because we're used to associating arguments and reasoning with people we like, and we're used to rejecting ideas from people we don't like. However, please, please, please keep this in mind. Reasons are never right because of who said them, and they are never wrong because of who said them. You can trust me on this. Circular reasoning. Circular reasoning is another type of fallacy that is kind of hard to detect because people are clever with the words they use. Circular reasoning means you use a conclusion to provide reasons that the conclusion is true. You are using the conclusion to provide reasons that the conclusion is true. Now, how do people do this? Well, they do this by using phrases that mean the same thing in different sentences. So here's an example. Capital punishment deters crime by scaring criminals. Therefore, conclusion, we know that it prevents criminal activity. Does preventing criminal activity mean anything different than deterring crime? No, it means the same thing. This is a circular argument. Eating meat is wrong because, conclusion, it is not right to eat meat. Okay, what does wrong mean? Doesn't it just mean not right? This is circular reasoning. It's using the conclusion to provide reasons that the conclusion is true. Here's another tricky one. He is an expert because he wrote several books. Really? Well, I wonder what makes him an expert. Well, I'll tell you. Only an expert could have written that many books. What? No. This is circular reasoning again. It's taking the same sentence and just paraphrasing it in another way so that it means the same thing. It's using the conclusion to give reasons that the conclusion is true. This is silly. Please avoid this and look for it carefully when other people are using it on you. This is another very common type of fallacy. This is called the hasty generalization. And I'm going to put you in the shoes of a college applicant. Hasty generalization is when there's not enough evidence, especially statistics, to provide a reason to believe the conclusion. So, imagine this. There are 2 students from a particular high school, yours, who were lousy in college. Therefore, the majority of students from that high school, yours, must be poor students. Can you see why this is wrong? Are just 2 students out of, 1,000 enough to, is that enough evidence to mean that, well, just everybody coming from that college is going to be lousy? No, absolutely not. This is a hasty generalization. Here's another silly one. It has rained for 3 days in a row. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Hey, that's more than 2. I think I'm gathering more evidence here, right? Not a hasty generalization, is it? Oh, so I'm going to conclude that it will never stop raining. It's just going to rain forever. It's rained for 3 days now. It will never stop raining. It's going to be like Noah's flood. Okay. Yes, this is silly. This is a silly, hasty generalization. So, when is something not a hasty generalization? When there's enough evidence. And when there's enough evidence to show a trend. Think about that Earth temperature thing. 5 years wasn't long enough to really show a trend that humans are causing global warming. In fact, when people are doing that kind of statistic, they're thinking back hundreds and hundreds of years. Here's another tricky logical fallacy. It's called affirming the consequent. Listen carefully. Going to college will get you a good job. I think that probably most of you still believe that that's true. Some of you don't. That person over there has a good job. They're a millionaire. They're making lots of money. So clearly, they must have gone to college. And they must have graduated college, summa cum laude, with honors and everything else, right? Because that's what it takes to get a good job. What if that person I was pointing to was Richard Branson or Bill Gates? Both of whom never finished college, and both of whom are billionaires. Okay, well, they clearly have good jobs, they clearly have good careers, but they didn't go to college. So going to college will get you a good job. That could be true, but that doesn't mean that everybody who has a good job went to college. Here's another example of affirming the consequent. That guy is in very good shape. Okay, I'll give you that. You can define that however you want. He can run really far, he can stretch, he's got muscles, whatever. Well, people who play basketball are in good shape. Do you think that's true? I generally think that's true. So clearly, this person that I'm looking at who's in good shape, he must be a basketball player. Why is this wrong? Can you think of other reasons why somebody might be in good shape even though they're not a basketball player? I'm sure you can. So both of these are examples of affirming the consequent. So Yes, people who play basketball are in good shape, but the opposite isn't always true. Just because you're in good shape doesn't mean that you're a good basketball player. Here is a great logical fallacy. And this logical fallacy is really, really hard for us in democratic societies to understand because we love majority rule. We think that the crowd is almost always right. And, something is true if most people believe it. Think about this carefully. Most people believe that eating meat is not immoral. So how can eating meat be immoral? Okay, this is a logical fallacy. Not everyone agrees that humans are causing climate change. Nearly everyone agrees that humans are causing climate change. Therefore, climate change is real. Do you believe this conclusion? Do you believe the reasons for that conclusion, though? Here we go. This is a real kicker. For thousands of years, even the smartest people on Earth believed that the sun orbited the Earth. Therefore, the sun orbits the Earth. Is that conclusion wrong? You bet it is. Was this reason up here an appeal to the majority? Yes, it was. The best way to spot an appeal to majority issue is just to remember this question in your mind. Can lots and lots of really smart people be wrong about something? Yes. Yes, 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 they can. So, the majority could be right, the majority could be wrong, but that being the majority doesn't make the conclusion right or wrong. So, now that we've gone over a lot of things and you know some things about logic, it's time for the assignment. Go and read the 10 arguments that are posted on the website. These are very, very short arguments, and I just kind of want you to go to step 2. Evaluate them. Do you think these are good arguments, or are you spotting some fallacies? I'm not telling you which ones are which, but let me know if you can spot any fallacies there. And, most importantly, I'd like you to go back to those editorials you read and read them. And I want you to think about their issue, their conclusions, and their reasons again. But this time you're going to critically evaluate those reasons. And I'd like you to think about and write down whether or not you think those reasons are good and whether or not they still seem good. You might have been persuaded the first time you read it, but now that you understand a little bit things about logic and especially logical fallacies, maybe you're not going to be so persuaded anymore. Go ahead and do that assignment, and thanks for using educator.com.